Okay. Well, then let me officially welcome y'all. Let's get started here. So this is our review for the Evolution Exam 2019. So I'm going to be open for questions. Going to try to keep it a little short tonight, maybe an hour or so. But feel free to chime in, and I will try to answer your questions as best I can. Hi, Kevin. Hi, Andy. Daniel, nice to see y'all. I don't really have a lot of general comments about the exam other than what I gave in class today. Really, if you were confident about those exam review questions and you could do the vocabulary matching and write a good FRQ, you should be good. But you might want to have out your unit guide and just run through that and make sure you're comfortable with everything. Okay, so let's get started. Ria, asking about the evolution of human skin color. Always a popular topic. So, when you're going to talk about the evolution of human skin color, you really want to kind of cover the whole evolution of it, which means starting with our ancestors back when our ancestors still had body hair, right? And therefore the skin underneath would have been light because you wouldn't want to waste energy making melanin if you have body hair covering it, right? And the body hair would be protection against UV light anyway. So at some point, for other reasons, probably related to being able to efficiently lose heat, our ancestors started to evolve to lose their body hair. By the way, brief break here. Here's a little kitty break. Miss Miss Penny Girl says hello. So our ancestors would have lost their body hair gradually, and then as a result, their skin would have been exposed to the UVB light without a lot of protection from melanin. And there would have been fairly strong selection for having even slightly darker skin to protect the skin, because if the skin was just completely exposed to the UVB light, those folate vitamins in the bloodstream would literally get broken down, and the person would not be able to have enough folate for their various functions. And folate's important for a whole lot of things. It actually has a role in DNA replication and cell division, as well as something specific to reproduction, like sperm production in men, and helping the embryo to develop its brain and spinal cord in babies. So, without enough of that folate, you're likely to either not be able to reproduce or to have some pretty bad birth defects in your offspring. So there would be fairly strong selection in a relatively short period of time for darker skin color. And that would have changed, it did take some time for the body hair to go away as well. So those things were sort of evolving in tandem. So, fast forward a little ways until you have these sort of, naked early humans that don't have much body hair anymore, but they do have darker skin. And they're doing, pretty well in equatorial Africa, but then some populations of them are leaving, perhaps going south to southern Africa or north up to Eurasia, and encountering higher latitudes where there is, quite a bit less intensity of UVB light, and that lower intensity of UVB light means that less UVB light will be absorbed. Not really an issue for the folate, because at that point the UVB light is weaker and weaker and the skin is pretty dark. But there does start to be an opposing selection, which is the selection having to do with being able to produce enough vitamin D. Because if you have dark skin and you're blocking out all that UVB light, then you're going to have a hard time absorbing enough UVB radiation to catalyze the reaction of vitamin D in your skin. And vitamin D, of course, is also essential for many things related to our health, but specifically bone health, absorbing enough calcium and storing it in your bones properly, immune health, things like that. Probably some things having to do with your brain and your mood as well. So there would be, again, fairly strong selection at these higher latitudes for organisms, humans in this case, who had slightly lighter skin tone. right? And it's not like it suddenly went from really dark to really light. That's not how things work. But there would have been a small range, maybe some a little bit lighter, a little bit darker, because it's a polygenic trait, right? So when lots of genes are influencing it, you're going to just get a range without having to have a special mutation necessarily. So those humans, early humans, that were a little bit lighter would have been selected for in these higher latitudes with weaker UVB light because they would have been a little bit more able to absorb the UVB light and make enough vitamin D. And again, as you get to these higher and higher latitudes, the UVB is so weak that the selection to protect folate becomes less important, right? So as as humans move up and down through the latitudes, there's different relative selection. Near the equator, the selection is strong for darker skin to replace the folate, or I'm sorry, to protect the folate. As humans move into the higher latitudes, north or south, the selection for being able to produce vitamin D becomes more important. And anywhere in between, it's just sort of a mixture until you get sort of a spectrum of skin colors that are optimized in any particular latitude for being dark enough to protect the folate and being light enough to produce vitamin D, right? And the organisms who have that sort of optimized skin color are going to be best able to survive and reproduce. So over time, you get a change in the average of skin color in different areas. And, you know, relative to major human evolution like bipedalism or a whole new species, this is relatively fast, right? Because humans haven't had a lot of time in any given area. They kind of kept moving around. So this selection for skin color, because it relies on just a few genes, is more like microevolution. It can happen, you know, relatively quickly. I don't know exactly how many generations, but, you know, much less than it took, again, for the sort of macroevolution of something like becoming bipedal, right? And that's why it's considered part of modern human evolution and something that can change without making us an entirely new species, right? So we get the spectrum of skin colors that we have today, but without actually having a bunch of new species running around, right? Plus, again, remember that we were always interbreeding with each other and moving. So, you know, skin color could have gotten lighter and darker in various groups of people as they moved around the globe if they sort of stayed put long enough for that selection to make a difference. It would have certainly taken, you know, a few generations. Let's go ahead and move on to another topic here. You know, and again, if a topic's been hit, I spent some time on that, so I'll try to make sure that I address some other topics. So Abby's asking about how do we determine what's a species? Well, fortunately for you, you don't personally have to determine it, but if you mean scientists, they really have to use a collection of evidence, right? So I went over this idea of multiple independent lines of evidence because, you know, determining a species can be very difficult. Many things look a lot alike, and yet they're different in some important ways. Other things have a lot of variation within the species, and yet there is still one species. Okay, domestic dogs is a great example of that. So if we're trying to determine if two organisms are the same species or two populations, we're going to look at a number of factors and try to determine how similar are they really. Okay, and depending what type of organism they are, we might look at things like structure, and you can use structure whether it's an animal or a plant or even a bacteria. Okay, and nowadays, of course, we're going to look at DNA sequence, also very helpful, especially for bacteria, where sometimes that is the most distinguishing characteristic. If they are plants or animals, we might look at things like their ecological niche, right? So animal, you know, food, behavior, you know, mating practices, things like that, right? If it's a plant, we could also look at things like, you know, when they flower or different things about their physiology that might help us to understand whether they're a separate species. And so that's ecological species concepts. These are called species concepts, this idea that we could define species in these different ways. Okay, so there's genetic species concept, morphological, ecological, and then the sort of one that people tend to think of most, which is reproductive. Can the organisms breed together? Now, keep in mind that really works best with animals, to some extent with plants, but plant reproduction can get actually quite complicated. So we use that a lot for animals. But of course, it doesn't work at all for asexually reproducing organisms because that's just not how they work, right? And we also have to look a little more carefully at what do we mean by they can breed together. Do we mean that they're just capable of it, even if they don't usually do that in nature? Normally it means it's more important to us if they would breed naturally in nature, right? And especially if they can make offspring that are also viable, able to have offspring of their own. Because if that's not the case, probably they really are different species that perhaps used to be closely related or used to even be the same species, but they've sort of separated enough that there's not much gene flow naturally anymore, and in fact will probably become more and more separated over time. Okay, and sometimes if we're not quite sure, if we think that not quite enough differences have accumulated to make them different species, remember we can use terms like subspecies, right, to sort of clarify that they're pretty different, right, and perhaps they're just on their way to becoming new species. Daniel has a question about a fused chromosome. I'm not going to go into detail on that because I took that off of the content for this unit. But I'll give you the 10-second version, which is that humans have one of their larger chromosomes, chromosome 2, I should say one of ours, we're humans, that is very clearly a fusion of two chromosomes that are in chimpanzees and other great apes. We can just tell by the genetic pattern that early in the human lineage breaking off, these two chromosomes that our ancestors had fused together and made one chromosome. But the actual DNA sequence is nearly identical. So it's very clear that we had a common ancestor that had that same DNA sequence, right? So it's a really nice, elegant evidence that we were related. It's a type of genetic molecular evidence. Hannah's asking, I thought skin color evolved from dark to light. So skin color can evolve back and forth a whole bunch of times, right? If groups are moving around the Earth. So if you're talking about back before there were even modern humans, like a time when we were evolving from earlier primates that had body hair, our ancestors did go from light to dark originally. And then as some of them moved to higher latitudes, they went from dark to light. And, they could have moved south and that population could have evolved to be darker again. Okay, so Nether's asking about the owls. So if you're dealing with owls, or any organism really, that only has discrete color states, like a light and a dark version, that's nothing like humans where we have a multitude, a spectrum of different skin colors. So we have a spectrum of different skin colors because it is polygenic, right? And that creates a lot of variety. If it's a trait that only has two distinct states, like light and dark, for example, or gray and brown, then that indicates that it's a single gene, that if that is a different allele for that gene, which could have been a new mutation, or it could be a different allele that was in the population all the time, but maybe at low frequency, right? And for whatever reason, maybe there's selection for one of those alleles, and there might be selection for the light or dark version of that particular animal. Okay. Thank you, Brady. I appreciate it. My throat's feeling a little better than it was this morning, for sure. Thanks for your concern. Why do owls camouflage? Okay, so this is another question about the owls. Owls are top predators. I'm not saying they never need to hide from anything. Maybe, I think especially their babies might need to be hidden. But really, the advantage for a predator, there's still advantage in camouflaging if you're a predator, right? Because your prey is less likely to see you as you get closer, right? You don't stand out so much. So camouflage is often an advantage whether you're predator or prey. Puri's asking about, do large populations evolve faster than small populations? And this is a bit of a complicated question. It's not nearly as simple of a connection as generation time and selection strength, which might as well review those quickly, right? So stronger selection in general is going to make populations evolve more quickly, I should say, because if more of them are dying, right, then the ones that are able to survive are going to sort of create the whole new population in a very small number of generations. And so that whole population can change a lot faster, right? If there is a long generation time, for a variety of reasons relating to variation, it takes a long generation time organism much longer to evolve, right? To generate variation and to go through generations that allow the population to be different than it was before. So those were both pretty straightforward. A goes to B. Population is a little bit different because it really depends on the circumstances. If you have a large population, but there is strong selection and there's plenty of genetic variation in that population, then the population will likely just evolve pretty quickly along with the selection, right? Especially if they have a short generation time. Okay, a little bit more slowly if they have a longer generation time. However, if it's a small population, there's not generally going to be a lot of genetic variation in that population. So if there's strong selection, meaning of course that the environment is changing very fast, the environment might be changing in ways that that population just doesn't have the variation to cope with. You know, a very simplistic example would be that, you know, it's getting very cold and none of the organisms in the population can have variation to have enough fur to stay warm, right? In which case, it's possible that that population will simply all die off before, you know, anyone just happens to have a mutation, right? Which happens slowly for that particular change in the environment. So it's very possible that that population will simply go extinct. We really see this being important when humans are involved, right? Because if humans are the selection, we're often either killing things or destroying their habitat very quickly. And if it's a small population, especially with a longer generation time, it's pretty likely we're just going to kill the entire population and cause the species to go extinct before they have time to either reproduce and generate variation, or they just, you know, don't have the variation in the first place. Charlotte had one other question about the selection against humans, or at least our ancestors having body hair. You know, I don't know that we know this absolutely for sure, but my understanding is it most likely had to do with being able to sweat and to be able to control your body temperature that way, right? Sweating is a great way to control body temperature because if you can sweat, you can dissipate heat very quickly and you won't overheat, right? So perhaps if our ancestors were, you know, also starting to move around more, not in the shade of the trees, things like that. Not sure exactly, but that would have been sort of a reasonable selection for you know, for having less body hair. Okay. Oh, so thank you. Somebody also answered the question about heat a little bit. Okay, give me a second. I want to catch up with some of the messages here. Okay, Daniel, thanks for giving a good example of stabilizing selection. Pranay, I'll quickly answer your question about the term humans. That term can be used, my understanding is, for anything after the split from chimpanzees. Certainly anything that's in the Homo genus, so Neanderthals for sure are a type of human. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe that Australopithecus and Ardipithecus are also considered early humans. I'm not sure that's completely consistent, so don't completely quote me on that. But I'm sure that everything in the Homo genus is considered human. Nathan, I don't know the exact number of generations for human skin color. I would say many, probably not, to be honest. Because remember, humans have a long generation time, and there hasn't been that much time that humans have been moving around, you know, but in one place long enough to separately evolve these skin colors separate from other populations of human, because we know now that many other traits evolved during that time. So I don't know the exact number of generations, but if I had to be sort of vague and relatively accurate, I'd probably say something like relatively few, because many generations to me implies macroevolution, speciation, like bipedalism, right? A whole new species, okay? Or major traits that are very difficult to evolve. Skin color is pretty easy, right? There really are just a few genes that are going to control that, so it can change relatively quickly. Getting a few questions that are related to the video about oxygenation. First of all, definitely would recommend you just rewatch the video. It's pretty short. But I can kind of quickly go through the main ideas. Um, you know, the sort of big idea is that the Earth didn't used to have oxygen, right? Or little to no oxygen. And that happened only because organisms started to evolve the process of photosynthesis, which produces oxygen as a product, right? And when those organisms first started doing this, and this was like cyanobacteria and such, right? Um, there was no organism using up the oxygen, right? Today, this all sort of balances itself out because we have organisms that are producing oxygen through photosynthesis. We have other organisms that are using oxygen through cellular respiration. So the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere has remained relatively stable for a while. But at this time, there was no oxygen. As the photosynthesizers are producing it, no one's using it. So the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere is going up and up and up, gradually, but going up, right? So oxygen's a molecule, and it has chemical reactions with other molecules, right? And you don't need to take a deep dive into the chemistry about why the ocean was blue or red. That's not really the important part. The important part is to sort of think about the effect. This is sort of like a form of coevolution, in a way, right? As life was happening, life actually started to affect the physical Earth and the Earth's atmosphere and the Earth's oceans. And then in turn, the Earth's atmosphere and the Earth's oceans influenced life, right? So that's actually the big concept of why we learned that. It's an example of this idea of sort of these interactions between the Earth's abiotic systems and the living biotic systems, the biosphere. So in this particular case, you get this buildup of oxygen, over some period of time, right? And then at some point, that the oxygen is starting to react more and more with other molecules. And most important for this example, the oxygen is starting to react with the greenhouse gases, because the atmosphere, before it had a lot of oxygen, had a relatively higher level of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane. Okay, and as the oxygen interacts with them, it decreases the concentration of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Well, you should remember from ecology that the concentration of greenhouse gases has a big influence on the Earth's climate, right? And specifically, if you have a higher concentration of greenhouse gases, more heat is being reflected back to Earth, right? And that keeps the Earth warmer. If you have a lower concentration of greenhouse gases, then more heat is going to bounce back off into space, and the Earth is going to get colder. So again, as the oxygen reacted with these greenhouse gases, the concentration of the greenhouse gases went down pretty dramatically, and that means all that heat was bouncing off into space, and you started to get a glaciation, right? The Earth becoming covered with ice, and it sort of has this runaway effect, and made the Earth kind of a big ice ball for a really long time. Kitty break. Hello, that's Pinky. Say hi, Pinky. So that, of course, in turn, had impacts on the planet, because all these organisms that were on the planet were, not adapted to this changing climate, to the global glaciation. They weren't adapted to having oxygen in the atmosphere. And oxygen is a really reactive molecule. That's why it makes things, well, one of many things is it makes certain things rust, right? But oxygen can be very damaging to living things. We actually have to protect ourselves from oxygen at all times. So having this oxygen around was damaging because it changed the climate, and the oxygen itself was somewhat damaging. So all of these changes caused the first great mass extinction. Okay, so that wiped out a lot of life on Earth for, quite some time, right? And then as life started to come back after a long period of time, right, you had a period of speciation of organisms that were not only able to survive in these higher levels of oxygen, and this is all after the climate has kind of stabilized again, by the way. So not only do these organisms are they able to sort of cope and survive with the oxygen in the atmosphere, but more importantly, some of them evolve the ability to use the oxygen to do chemical reactions of their own, namely to oxidize and break down food molecules like glucose much more efficiently, right? In processes, probably not at first, but eventually culminating in processes like cellular respiration, right? And then you have a situation where you have this very, very efficient method of getting fuel, right? And those organisms really becoming very successful, so that now, vast numbers of organisms on this planet can do cellular respiration. And by doing that, they are absorbing a lot of the oxygen out of the air and actually helping to stabilize the concentrations of these gases and therefore stabilize the climate, right? Until we start cutting down too many trees and burning fossil fuels. But that's another story for another day. Um, Yes, in regards to Grace and Daniel asking about would you need to include vitamin D, why vitamin D is important in VIST, you need to do so to the extent, and this is true for any of the selections that you describe, you need to describe it to the extent that you make a clear connection between what's happening in survival and reproduction, right? Because if if the trait affects the organism in some way that doesn't affect survival and reproduction, it's not that big of a deal for selection. Um, Okay, and while we're on that topic, Claire's asking about vitamin D deficiency. And the answer is really just that, probably first and foremost, that we're indoors so much of the time, right? That in the past, humans would have been outdoors a lot more. And it's interesting because you don't actually need to be outside a lot to produce enough vitamin D, but you do need to some. And, I don't know about you guys, but there's plenty of days that I go inside practically before daylight comes and I don't come out again until after dark, right? And particularly this time of year, even if we're outside for a few minutes, it's probably not enough. If your skin is darker, most definitely not enough, right? Now, if it's summertime and you're out and about during the day, you're probably fine. For most people, if their skin isn't too dark, 10 to 15 minutes of sun exposure a day is probably sufficient. But for many people, they don't even get that, right? Or their skin is dark for the area that they're living in. And in those cases, they very likely will have vitamin D deficiency. There's just no, there's a whole lot of debate right now about what level of vitamin D is sufficient, but you don't need to worry about that. Okay, hold on. I'm going to catch up with questions again. Give me a moment. I'm going to scan them and see if I can kind of connect some of them together. Prasanth, yes, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals did interbreed. A fair amount, enough that modern humans have noticeable Neanderthal DNA. We don't know exactly why the Neanderthals went extinct. Maybe changes in the climate that they weren't well adapted to, maybe conflict with humans, some combination. We're not sure. Keep in mind, many, many species go extinct. It's actually not unusual. Oh, thanks. Larry did a little research. He found a number there for the optimal time for human populations to adapt different skin pigmentation, 10 to 20,000 years. Okay, thank you. And, that sounds like a lot to us, but keep in mind that, modern humans are thought to have left Africa 200 to 250,000 years ago. So 10 or 20,000 is actually not that much. And I know it's hard for our brains to kind of wrap our heads around those lengths of time, but that's actually considered not a huge amount of time, right? It's a significant number of generations, but still not close to what you would need for like remember that our lineage branched off of chimpanzees 7 million years ago. So there's a real difference in scale there. And this is why I'm going to keep pushing you guys to learn comparative language. It is so helpful because you can use words like somewhat, relatively, largely, right? And you can get across an idea without knowing exact numbers. And that's super important. So keep working on that ability to express ideas as clearly as you can, even if you don't know accurate numbers, right? So just reading the rest of Lawrence's message. Yeah, he's talking about if the evolutionary pressure is stronger, even in as little as 100 generations. Yeah, 100 generations isn't much over evolution. That's actually quite little. Because we're talking the amount of time it took humans to move around the globe was tens of thousands of years, right? So this is a fraction of the time as they were moving around the globe. Okay, thanks so much, Larry. That's interesting. I'll make a note of that for the future. Okay. Yeah, and a lot of it's going to have to do with the selection pressure, how sort of mismatched for the environment that they were. Okay. Siraj is talking about owls hunting at night. I don't think they totally hunt at night. They might a little bit. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question, Siraj. I don't know. This was taken from a real example. So for these particular owls, it must have made a difference. I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know that owls completely hunt at night. Maybe not all the species. I'm not sure. Let's not overthink this. Let's assume for purposes of the FRQ that these owls benefited from camouflaging. Okay? But yeah, you make a good point, Siraj. I agree. I think some owls do hunt at night. But again, we got that example from some real data. So I don't know the whole backstory. We've had a few questions about the types of selection, disruptive, directional, and stabilizing. Again, I'm going to refer you to the book, has really nice descriptions as well as my PowerPoint. But if I want to do kind of a quick version of that, directional is probably the one we talk about the most. The skin color is a great example of directional selection. It just means that the average, or in some cases the frequency, that would work too, moves in one direction or another. More of something, less of something. Right? Whereas if it's stabilizing, the frequency of alleles, or even the frequency of that trait, the range is going to get smaller because there's selection for being more in the middle. Okay? And there's a number of things that work this way. I think a classic example is sort of the weight of babies when they're born, birth weight. But actually, this is pretty common. Think about giraffes. There was selection at some point for giraffes' necks to become longer, right? And that would be directional selection, right? Longer and longer. And then at some point, there's going to start to be disadvantage to having such a long neck, right? So it starts to kind of stabilize. And if there's not selection against it in the other direction, it might just remain how it is for a long period of time. So it's not uncommon for directional selection to become stabilizing selection, right? Disruptive is where there's selection for two different states, right? Something more and something less. This could be with color or size or some other feature or body, something like that. For a variety of reasons, often it's because organisms are taking advantage of two different niches. They start to spread out and not interact with each other as much. I don't know, it may not be as common as the other two, it probably is not, but, people hypothesize that is how some forms of speciation may start. If you have disruptive selection and you start to get two populations of organisms, or I wouldn't say that, you start to get organisms within a population that are more and more different and perhaps don't interact or interbreed with each other quite as much. So Elton, excuse me, Elton is asking about classification and how is each determined? I'm not sure I understand your question. How is each determined whether two species are in it? All of these groupings are based on traits, right? Whether that's a morphological trait or a genetic trait or an ecological trait. And we put organisms, I mean, in general, this is what classification is, right? We put organisms in groups that share similar traits, assuming that they share them because they inherited them from a common ancestor, right? If they're convergent, we don't put them in the same group. But assuming that they share traits that they inherited from a common ancestor, we put them in a group, right? So birds and reptiles evolved from a common ancestor relatively recently. They share a lot of important traits, and so we put them very close on cladogram, right? But they are part of this larger group called vertebrates, right? That all share very important vertebrate traits, and so they're in this, larger group that's a subphylum, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a way of having these different levels allows us a lot of distinctions between how closely related things are. Okay, I'm not quite sure if that is your full question, but that's what I can do for now. Okay, again, give me a second. Sometimes these questions kind of slip around and it's hard for me to keep track. Okay, a few people asking about folate. I spent a good portion of time at the beginning of this live stream talking about skin color, so I want to move on to some other things. Feel free later on, you can re-listen to that first part of the live stream. And a few people are chiming in anyway. Thank you. Okay, I was asking about the difference between genetic drift and gene flow. Totally different things, even though drift and flow sort of sound alike, right? Gene flow literally just means genes are moving between one organism and another, okay? So that, I shouldn't say that. It can be between one, let me change that answer, okay? It just means the movement of genetic information. It can be between organisms in the case of horizontal gene transfer. Reproduction, sort of, but we don't usually call that gene flow. It could be because of migration, which moves genetic information from one population to another. It could be from hybridization, interbreeding, which would move genetic organization potentially between different species. So all those are forms of gene flow. Okay, genetic drift is a different thing. Genetic drift is any one of a number of kinds of things that can change the distribution of traits, the frequency of alleles that causes that distribution of traits within a population that is not connected to natural selection, right? So the example you had about the volcanoes sort of just randomly killing more goats with long hair or short hair, I can't remember which, right? That's genetic drift because the change, the average, you had a change in the average length of hair on the goats, totally unrelated to the volcano, right? Just kind of a byproduct. And that's a form of genetic drift. Again, remember, mostly we're going to notice that it's going to be a much greater impact, a disproportionate impact on small populations. Nathan, yes, you don't need to know the mechanism for the production of vitamin D, just the fact that we need to absorb sunlight in order to produce it is totally fine. Same thing, you don't have to know how the folates cause the neural tube defects, just that it affects these things related to reproduction in a negative way. Okay, Suraj is asking about that statement around why does evolution occur in populations and not individuals. Evolution can occur in individuals, cannot occur in individuals, because the definition of evolution is that the next generation is different than the last one. Well, how can that happen in an individual? It's not possible, right? So you have to have a reproducing population in order to have something that's different than the past, because individuals changing in their lifetime is not evolution, right? And so until you have the next generation, you can't even see if the frequency or distribution has changed, right? So that's, yeah, that's essentially the answer to your question. Larry's doing some fancy research tonight. Thank you, Larry. Should we memorize cladogram with all the organisms from the beginning of the year? Not sure which one you're talking about. Um, I gave you a cladogram for practice that kind of showed all life on Earth. No, I wasn't expecting you to memorize that. For purposes of the exam, the emphasis is going to be on interpreting a cladogram. Can you figure out the most recent common ancestor? Can you figure out how closely related organisms are and compare that? Can you figure out if a trait evolves, which lineages should have that trait based on looking at the cladogram? That's about the level that you would need to know. um, Anushka, for the evolution vocabulary review, um, fitness is just a term. It's a more quantitative term. It's literally like the number of babies, not the fact that you can reproduce a lot. Um, Fecundity, I don't know that it's usually used as a quantitative term, like you had X number of babies, whereas when we do models and simulations for evolution, we actually would do kind of quantitative measurements, right? Fecundity is just sort of like, it's a more qualitative term. I think you know those words. For meaning being able to make a lot of babies. But it doesn't have this particular meaning that fitness does in the field of evolution, where we're actually using it as a measurement of how much your genes get passed on. Okay, so they do have very similar meanings. They're just used in different ways. And also, fecundity, honestly, is a less common word, and it's not a word um, uh, that you need to know that I'm going to hold you to. It was one that was just in the particular reading. Okay, somebody's asking about why you didn't find domain very much in the textbook. That's because the textbook is 20 years old. Okay, domain is a relatively recent taxonomic category, and so you may not find it much in some of the older things because it didn't exist yet. I'm not exactly sure when it came out, but it's been around for a while now. But it is a relatively new one. I can tell you when I was your age, Pluto was still a planet, and there were no domains. It was just kingdom, phylum, etc. Okay, but now there are domains. Okay, Jed is asking about the example of bacteria and coevolution. So very similar to many predator-prey situations, if a bacteria evolves the ability to produce an antibiotic, that is selected for because it can kill its competition. However, if some of those other bacteria around it have a mutation that gives them resistance, they are selected for. Now, for that original bacteria to have the same advantage, there's going to be selection for it to have additional mutations, or any additional mutations would be selected for that allow it to produce stronger or different antibiotics. And now you've got a different selection pressure on the other bacteria, right? So you have these two organisms, or many organisms potentially in the case of bacteria, evolving alongside each other in response to each other, right? In the same way that, for example, a pollinator and a plant could co-evolve to become more and more adapted to each other as opposed to adapted to an abiotic environment. And that is coevolution. Puri is asking about the time related to the owls. I would say keep in mind that, the big concept here that I want you guys to get is that there is a difference between complex polygenic traits that take there's sort of, I guess, almost like three levels, right? You have traits that are single gene traits where if there's strong selection, you can change that frequency of alleles, literally in a generation or two, right? Very quickly, assuming that the allele exists. If you have to wait for a mutation, it takes a little longer, right? You have relatively simple polygenic traits like skin color that take a little longer, but then you have like entire body structures or species that are going to take a really long time because now you're talking about hundreds or thousands of genes, right? And you're talking about processes of macroevolution of speciation that take a really long time. So again, you don't need to know the exact amount of time, but you can certainly imply that it is relatively few or many, many, right? So I think it's that understanding that different kinds of traits take different amounts of time to evolve. That's really kind of what you want to get across. Larry, I was giggling at your rinse and repeat. Really appreciate your humor. Kevin's asking about why did the Neanderthals go extinct and not us? I don't know. I mean, ultimately we are more well adapted. I wouldn't say we, because actually that's much later. But at the time, we must have been better adapted to our environments, right? Okay, sorry. Let me figure out where I am here. Because of the growing frequency of antibiotic resistance. Okay, Rand, I'm reading one of your messages and I want to clarify here. You wrote because of the growing frequency of antibiotic resistance, bacteria start to make stronger and more powerful. You're saying venom, but I think you mean antibiotics. You can't, the bacteria can't do this on purpose because we're using antibiotics, right? Remember that it is a result of random mutations that the bacteria already had. Okay, so be really careful because you're implying that the antibiotics made the bacteria evolve more resistance. The antibiotics selected for resistance that's already there. Okay, so just be really careful. You're kind of treading in the direction of doing that. Okay, thank you, Daniel, for clarifying the comment about humans and chimpanzees. They just share a common ancestor. Yeah, and Larry makes a good point that humans weren't always that successful either, that we almost went extinct. There was this big bottleneck. So, we just lucked out, right? Or we had some traits that helped us through that time. Oh, thanks, Dylan. So domains started in 1990. Yeah, your books were published in, I want to say like in the late 90s, but I'm still not sure. I can't remember right at this moment if domains are in your book. I think they are actually. I think that was early after domains came out, but it was still fairly new at that time. Prasant is asking, like, what level do you need to know for domain, kingdom, phylum? A really, really basic level. Like, we talked about domains being at the level of eukaryotes and prokaryotes, right? We talked about, some of the major kingdoms that I think are familiar to you guys. I mean, I think you know that animals are a kingdom and plants are a kingdom and fungi are a kingdom, right? There's actually a whole bunch of other kingdoms now, way beyond what's in your textbook, but there are ones that you don't know about as much. So I would say for kingdoms, you should certainly know about ants and ants and plantimals. Whew, getting late. Plants and animals and fungi are kind of the three kingdoms that I would like you to know as common knowledge if you don't already. We didn't talk about specific phyla, which is the plural for phylum, except for chordata. Okay. Maria, you can just call the gray owls gray owls. That's fine. Um, Antibiotics for if we use antibiotics for unnecessary things or overuse antibiotics, that kills most of the bacteria, but the survivors adapt. No, the survivors already were adapted. Okay? So the reason that those bacteria didn't get killed by the antibiotic is they already had the mutation for antibiotic resistance. So their population increases, right? Because they can pass on that resistance. But, you know, the survivors don't adapt. Okay? The population adapts because now the population only consists of the survivors, right? So the population is now more well adapted than it was in the past. But no individuals changed, okay? And not genetic drift is like natural selection in the sense that it changes alleles or traits in a population, okay? But for reasons that aren't selection. So yes, based off of things that are more related to chance. Oh, thanks, Grace, for checking the textbook. Yeah, I couldn't remember for some reason if that was in there. Yes, it is. Well, that's an interesting question. Daniel's asking, are there some particular things we should avoid when writing for the FRQ? I would say honestly, like, don't say too much, right? Like, really focus on just those key points as they're written in the rubric and the writing prompt and the writing guide. Um, include the detail that you need to make that example clear, but don't go off on some tangent. I mean, A, it'll take up your time. B, I'm looking for you to be concise. And C, frankly, you're more likely to say something that's wrong, right? So just kind of stick to the basics. But for the example you choose, figure out, does it need to be customized for VI, S, or T, right? In order to make that particular example clear. Um, in terms of common errors, some people just don't include they don't make logical connections. Like for skin color, are you really making a connection between the UV light um, and the strength of the UV light, the effect on those vitamins, and then connecting that to survival and reproduction? For the bacteria example and the convergent evolution example, don't just do VIST. You need to connect it to the idea of coevolution and the idea of convergent evolution. But don't just do that and forget to do VIST, right? So do just enough to completely answer the question, but not more. Kevin, that's not a stupid question. FRQ stands for free response. It's a term that's used, I know it's a little awkward, it's used on AP tests. Sometimes we call them short answer or essay questions. I don't like the term essay because it makes me think of like a 5-paragraph essay that you would write in Lit. That's not what this is. So it just means free response question. It means you write as opposed to like a multiple choice. Neverin, the generic VIST rubric is posted in the locker, and you can access that at any time. Suraj is asking how to connect mutations to evolution. So mutations provide the variation. If all the organisms are the same and they never had a mutation, honestly, they'd either all survive or they all wouldn't, right? At some point, they wouldn't, right? At some point, the environment would change and they'd all die. So if you didn't have random mutations, you'd never have a chance for anything to become different and therefore possibly be the ones to survive as the environment changes. So evolution occurs because there is variation. That's the first step. That's why we start with variation in VIST. Um, Raymond, as far as whether you need to say after each generation, it's kind of a context thing. After each generation, you're just trying to say it's changing. Now, with that, of course, you don't really convey the amount of time. But you're right. I mean, all these things are still evolving, right? Think about human skin color, right? As humans moved, it kept evolving, right? Darker, lighter, if they were moving up and down in latitude. Um, so I would say, start at the past, kind of end at some present point and call it good, right? Yeah, of course they may change again in the future. Last minute sources, Kevin. I'd say come back to basics. Use that light pink sheet a lot. But I wouldn't go randomly looking at sources, right? I would, boil it down to the things you really need to study. If you have to go back and look at those handouts, if you really need a different explanation of something, remember that there is a folder called Evolution Resources in the locker. But don't get too distracted. It's 9 o'clock the night before the test. Okay. Oh, I'm so glad the stuff in the locker is helpful to you, Daniel. Jed, I answered that question about defining a species earlier on in the live stream, so please check that out when you have a chance. Nathan, when you're talking about skin color, you don't really need to talk about random mutations. I mean, ultimately, in the history of the human species, yes, there were random mutations. But that's not why, if I take 100 people, they have slightly different skin color. It's like saying, the students at Monte Vista have different heights because of random mutations. That kind of implies that each student has a mutation that gives them some height. It doesn't work that way. They have different heights because there's like 100 variables that contribute to our height, and therefore we have differences in those variables, and we're going to have all different heights, right? So if you have a group of humans in a particular location, a population, it's not like, bing, one was born with a mutation and had a different skin color. It's just because of the nature of polygenic traits that you will always have a range. Okay? And remember, it's a fairly small range. They're just slightly lighter and darker. For the FRQ, Avia, you do not need to mention directional stabilizing and disruptive. I mean, I suppose you could, but it's not necessary. Again, kind of why do extra that might cause a problem. Ria, coevolution and convergent evolution. Yeah, a brief answer to that is that coevolution, as I mentioned with bacteria, is when one organism adapts or responds, is selected. I guess you could say the selection pressure for one organism is another organism, right? So organisms are evolving in response to one another, okay? Convergent evolution is when organisms that are not directly related, right, like they don't share an immediate common ancestor, because normally we'd expect that if two things share a common ancestor, they're going to share a lot of traits between them, right? But that if they come from different common ancestors, we wouldn't really expect that, okay? So if you have convergent evolution, you can get organisms that are actually in different lineages that, because they're exposed to the same selection pressure, they end up evolving similar phenotypes. Their phenotypes converge or become similar, right? The genetic basis for that might be very different, right? There might be different genes that cause those similar phenotypes, and the phenotypes don't have to be identical, right? We consider the fact that, a bat's wing and a bird's wing, right? The structure of those wings is somewhat different. The way they work is somewhat different, but the idea of having a wing that is well adapted for flight is an example of convergent evolution. Let's see, could there be natural selection because of genetic drift? No, they're really two different things, but they can both happen at the same time, like the example I gave in class about, a bunch of goats could have died from a disease, and you could have a few remaining goats that there was selection for disease resistance, but out of those few remaining goats, they happen to have longer hair on average. And then you've got some genetic drift happening around the trait of the hair, but you have natural selection for the disease resistance. Let's see. Jed, I don't have timestamps right now. I think you can make a transcript appear and see it that way, but I don't have it right at this moment. Ooh, let me check out the way Larry described this, probably more concisely than I did. Convergent is coming to the same result through different paths. Yeah, I like that. Coevolution is evolving alongside. Oh, very nice and much more concise than me. Thank you, Larry. the types of isolation. No, Kevin, you don't. You can get very technical about reproductive isolation, and there's like 15 different kinds, right? You don't need to know that for purposes of this. The main one that we talked about at all was geographic isolation, but honestly, for our purposes, it's fine if you just consider that reproductive isolation. Cullen, will we be given multiple prompts for the FRQ, or was that to give examples? No, that's the exact FRQ, Cullen. It'll be the exact same question. You'll have those same 4 options, and you can choose one of the 4. Okay, that's the exact same question that you'll see on the test. Okay. By the way, thanks you guys for calling out the sort of old trash messages. I am removing them, and it is unfortunate that people take up our time and energy with that. So that's it's a bummer. But we're going to try to keep the community positive here. Let's see here. But actually, you guys, it's actually helpful not to just keep adding messages. Don't give people the attention they're seeking. We'll just remove it. Okay. Oh, Dylan, thank you. So Dylan has some information about the timestamps. Clicking the 3 dots, and then you can enable timestamps. Am I supposed to do that? Okay, let me think about that when I'm not trying to read all the messages. Okay, I'll try to figure that out. Do you have any tips on how to write our VIST concisely? My recommendation would be, and I think we talked about this briefly with Nathan, but my recommendation would be 1 sentence for variation, right? In a population, et cetera, 1 sentence for inheritance, blah, 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 is a genetic trait. 1 to 2 sentences for selection. It kind of just depends on how complicated it is, right? But, remember, all you really need to do is say there's selection for, selection against. I'm probably going to advise selection for in most cases. This particular trait because blah, 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 that particular reason, and therefore this organism, or you can start a new sentence, as a result, these organisms are more likely to be able to survive and reproduce. More offspring, right? And again, you're going to embellish it and make it sound a little bit better for that example. But I think, again, if you can keep it to 1 for V, 1 sentence for I, 1 to 2 for S, T, you really should be able to do in 1 sentence. If you're feeling uncomfortable with that, maybe 2. But yeah, I really think you can keep it to 5 or 6 sentences. Please do. Kevin, no graphs. Multiple choice, matching, and FRQ. You don't need to talk about the future as part of the FRQ. Again, I don't see a lot of advantage to adding things. I just think you're likely to make a mistake, frankly, and it's kind of safer not to. I mean, I'm not going to strike you dead if you have 7 sentences in the FRQ, but in general, remember that being able to write concisely is an important skill. You want to be able to use powerful, brief language. Okay, I'm going to be wrapping up soon, so I'm just going to kind of scan the last questions here. Joseph, yes. That vocabulary question about the frequency of alleles remaining the same is genetic equilibrium. Because remember, evolution is when the frequency of alleles is changing. So if it's staying the same, we call that genetic equilibrium, which, for all intents and purposes, doesn't happen for any significant amount of time in nature. It's just, it's more of a hypothetical state that we can use to understand how much evolution is happening. Good advice, Larry. Navarin, regarding the convergent evolution, yeah, you can connect the selection pressures to the fish and the sharks, and then I think you're going to want to talk a little bit about there'd be selection for specific traits as a result of that. Ria, no, it's not going to be multiple matching. It'll be single matching, but there will be like a bank of words, and you're going to choose the most appropriate word term that goes with each of the examples. But there'll be examples similar to what you had in your vocabulary review. Thanks, Gavin. I think you guys will be okay. As always, use good test taking strategy, read carefully. Again, do keep an eye on the time. Remember to just answer each question to the best of your ability. Don't mark like 5 or 10 of them to go back to. That's terrible test taking strategy. Okay? Answer each question to the best of your ability. Probably don't go back. You probably won't have a lot of time to just choose the best answer, move on, don't stress out. Okay? You'll be okay. Anon, as far as like writing the FRQ in a certain tense, if you're describing something that happened in the past, I would use the past tense. You know, that being said, if you're talking about something being a polygenic trait, it still is, right? So you can say such and such is a genetic trait. It still is in the past, it was in the past and it is in the present. Okay, again, I'm just scanning for kind of new questions. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up. So thank you guys so much for participating, and I hope that was helpful to you. I wish you all the best on the test tomorrow, and yeah, I'm kind of excited to wrap up evolution. We'll be moving on to our next unit soon. So you guys have a great evening. Definitely get some good sleep, and I will see you all on Monday. Okay, take care. Night night.